All right, we'd like to get started now, if we could, and take seats. Our next, the panels this afternoon really come back down from the theoretical, I think, back down to the ground, and we're going to take a look at some case studies and what's going on kind of on the ground in the field. Beginning with this panel on case studies from the field, and this panel really is designed to give us more of an international perspective. So we're going to begin with a perspective on international development from Kanni Wignaraja, the director of the Capacity Development Group in the the United Nations Bureau for Development Policy. And I urge you to take a look at her full biography. You'll see that it's quite impressive, once again, a little bit intimidating. But her talk is entitled Where Economic and Environmental Justice Meet, Investing in Human Development.
Thank you very much. It's good to be part of this program, and thank you for inviting me. Wasn't that long that I was seated over at the Woodrow Wilson School, studying in the bowels of those halls. So it's good to be back in Princeton. I just want to put a few issues on the table coming from a range of country experiences across regions, but primarily in Asia, which is where I've spent most of my working life since finishing up here. But I want to ask the question that on this issue of environmental justice, are we capable of responding? I'd really like to focus on the issue of capacities here. Individual capacities, organizational capacities, and larger societal capacities around the world. To do that, I'd just like to take quite a mix of statistics, just a few, to just put in context the fact that we're really talking about a set of issues here that are quite interdisciplinary in nature. And so the places where we look for our facts and our data should also come from very different sources. And for me, one of the best things when I looked at both the gathering, your speakers, and the background for this work is that you are drawing from a range of different sources. So let me just put maybe 6 or 7 quick facts on the table. We know today that the richest 2% globally own 50% of global wealth. We also know that over 1 billion people lack access to potable water. You put on that the fact that 4 billion don't come anywhere close to the rule of law. The law just excludes approximately 4 billion people. Nearly 1.6 billion lack access to regular energy services. You add on top of that the fact that of the 100 largest economies of the world, 51 are global corporations. That alone is quite a startling fact. Now, in this kind of setting, drawing from very different places, we wonder how, and we've got to understand why, today the rise in the price of rice in Manila and the riots that are being caused there are very much related to the recent riots in the neighborhoods of Nairobi, to the disappearance, for example, of tuna in the Atlantic, and the fact that in many parts of the world we're losing not just our environmental assets, but our social assets and our economic assets globally. So I'd like to put to you that in 3 different cases that I'd like to present to you, the interrelatedness of these disciplines are causing some shocking trends. For example, my last 4 years was spent working around the Mekong Delta. And it took a while for us to understand that one of the major responses to regular flooding, which is getting increasingly intense around the Mekong Delta, was that children, from the time they're about 2 or 3, their main response, they're taught how to float in the water. The sense is the longer you are able to float, the longer your chances of getting picked up during the floods and surviving. And that response, that community response, is only now being looked at, and kids are being taught how to swim. Now, if I look at a similar example, which is when the tsunami affected Tamil Nadu, you'll see that a number of the deaths along the coastal areas in southern India were women. And there were 3 reasons why you saw the trend of women running towards the sea as opposed to away from the sea. First, they had to get to their kids. 2, they settled right along the coastline where they tethered their cows and they had to release the cows. And 3, 99% of them were wearing saris and couldn't run fast enough. Now, I'm putting these issues on the table because these issues of gender justice, of social justice, of property rights, these are at the heart of the issues that you have all been discussing this morning. And I want to put a set of responses with the lens of capacity that we've learned across the world. And I want to ask our 2 speakers who will be presenting in-depth cases whether these lessons resonate with them in their studies in particular situations. We found that there are 4 major drivers, if you wish, that really help to manage and to move transformations that are required to truly address issues such as environmental justice. And let me put them on the table. The first is your range of incentives that truly grow and retain capacities to respond. These incentives could be monetary in some communities, and in others, or it's a mix of monetary and non-monetary incentives. Interestingly, in large surveys done of community groups where they've looked at retention of capacities required to address issues of basic human development in communities, they found that it wasn't monetary incentives really that really drove the change. It was incentives that motivated people, such as the right to be heard, access to local leadership. These incentives seem to have a much stronger hold than the edge on a small cash supplement, although that went a long way as well. The second issue was the capabilities to respond in areas, and come back to the issue of the Mekong, had a lot to do with growing state-citizen accountability and voice mechanisms, and local institutions that really grew to enable that kind of empowering relationship that made demands on the state, made a significant change to the capacity to respond. And coming back to the Mekong, very soon women realized, and I come back to the issue that education and the rights of women have so much to do with this issue. Women realized that it was just not enough teaching their kids how to swim when a flood hit, because you were still losing about 50% of your children. Vietnam today estimates that in the next set of annual floods, 22 million people are going to lose their homes. Now, local institutions that have really agitated for a change in public policy, a change in public investment, and a change in infrastructure along the Mekong are moving forward this agenda beyond just the immediate response to a disaster. The third area that we've seen a vast impact on transformation is on the type of leadership leadership that protects the right of protection, leadership that really supports change. And this kind of motivational leadership is something that has been a significant shift in the way communities and countries respond. And the last one is a reinvestment in education. Certainly coming from the now working for the UN system, I know for a couple of decades, a lot of the emphasis on education had been removed or gotten dissipated. And you see an increasing return to investing in education. India alone today has realized that a lot of the work that it does on its anti-poverty programs should be looked at through the lens of education. And they're upping their budget in education to 6% of GNP, which is a big leap from the 2 to 3%, which was already a considerable amount. I want to look at two issues with which I want to drive home this issue of capacity. One is to tell a story of local capacity in the city of Chicago, and then take it to the international level. A tremendous learning that we've all had from the city of Chicago in the 19th century. I don't know if anyone here is from Chicago, but if you go back to your history books, it's quite a dramatic story. In the end of the 19th century, Chicago reported 20,000 deaths per year over the last quarter of the 19th century due to typhoid. And waterborne diseases had taken 12% of Chicago's population in those last years. Now that's a significant death toll due to the lack of awareness and the inability to call for action related to a very significant set of environmental issues. And waterborne diseases today, you see many of these Chicagos around the world. And 3 points of light came into being because they looked at it as a systemic issue and not one that could be dealt with at this magnitude in any one area of intervention. First, a change in public policy. So they went from completely unregulated private provision of water to municipalities being given a greater leeway to ensure equal provision of water across neighborhoods in Chicago. The second was instituting new public institutions. And when I use the word public, it doesn't need to be state, but in this case there were parastatal institutions that looked at water purification and water treatment. And so the issue, and it was built around Lake Michigan, which was the worst possible dumping ground for sewage at the time. And the last was a call for public action. Local leadership that really opened the doors to get the community involved in what they felt would be the right responses. And so it's a dramatic change in public voice on these issues from poor neighborhoods, which previously had had no access at all to leadership, to policy, and to these institutions. Now, if you look at the numbers, again, in the first quarter of that century, just the mortality rates, life expectancy rose by 16% in the first quarter, and waterborne diseases, typhoid was eliminated within 20 years. Now, it still took a while, but you can see how the dramatic, the three-part call to action really worked. I want to end by using that same model internationally, because the discussions you've had this morning take it from the local to the global. It's almost impossible anymore to draw these somewhat artificial boundaries, geographic boundaries certainly, on the environmental challenges that we've been talking about this morning. And if you take that case of Chicago and put it to an international level, the need for multilateral action in the field of environmental justice is critical. First, because it's a security issue. And we know over and over again that there isn't a security issue that can be dealt with a unilateral response. The second is it's a humanitarian issue. And just like post-tsunami, we found that multilateral action really provides the investment and the level of kind of moral appeal, I think, was the term used in the previous speaker, to bring a response that's broader than a unilateral response. And finally, it's a development issue. And you can't get away from the fact that it requires solutions to climate change mitigation that hold all parties both accountable and responsible. And so that it really requires a global deal across nations, across communities, and across class, race, gender, and other barriers. So I'd like to leave it there and ask whether the scanning that we've learned from a development field, when you apply it to particular cases, as you're going to hear now, the two cases, whether these lessons resonate in these instances. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Aquene Freechild, who works with the Environmental Health Fund, the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal, and the Dow Accountability Network. Her talk is entitled Bhopal, Marginalized People Combating Corporate Crime in a Globalized World.
Thank you, Kim. I have the privilege of working for the last 4 years with the survivors of the world's worst industrial disaster in history in central India. I work for the survivors. They run this movement called the International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal, and have been running movements since the 1984 disaster. A lot of the discussions earlier about morality and messaging and how do we get people to really grab a hold of environmental justice and environmental issues and make them their own really resonated with me, because as an activist, my main role here in the United States is certainly not to make decisions for the people I work for. It's to be a messenger. And I read a study a couple months back where the question of what appeals to a person to give money was raised through a bunch of different study groups. And they gave pictures of a group of children starving to 30 people or so, and they gave pictures of 2 children who desperately needed help to another group, and to a third group they gave a picture of 1 child that really needed your help. And hands down, of course, the 1 child got many, many more donations. But what I thought was interesting was that even 2 children got less than half as that 1 child. And it's my job, speaking about Bhopal, trying to aid what has become a global movement, combating a global corporation, to make that 1 child real to you. Because you may never go to Bhopal, but unless you feel the pull of a human being whom you can relate to, you're very unlikely to do something. And without your action, when we're talking about the largest chemical corporation in the United States, Dow Chemical, against some of the poorest people in urban India, there's absolutely no hope unless we can be as movable, mobile, empowered, diverse as Dow Chemical can be with the resources that they have. So quickly about Bhopal. This is the factory in central India. Union Carbide built this factory in the late 70s. They made a decision to put about 40 tons of methyl isocyanate in liquid form in storage tanks in order to save money in this factory. They also used phosgene in this factory. Phosgene was used to gas the Jews by the Nazis. Methyl isocyanate is twice as toxic. And so regardless of what safety precautions were taken at this plant, the way the plant was designed was completely unacceptable. And you can see the settlements along the factory, between a railroad and the factory. That's public land, and it attracts poor people, as well as the construction of the plant attract migrant labor. So immediately there was a population just adjacent to the plant for those reasons. December 3rd, 1984, a little bit after midnight, a 10-meter high cloud of toxic methyl isocyanate gas crept through the city of Bhopal. People awoke, they were coughing, their eyes were burning, they began running for their lives, and as they ran, they breathed in more of the gas and fell dead in the streets. Their lungs had filled with their own body fluids, and they suffocated to death. And by morning, more than 7,000 people were dead in the streets. There was no evacuation plan. There was no communication from Union Carbide for many hours, and when there was, it was completely inadequate and false information given to healthcare providers. In 1989, the Indian government finally settled with Union Carbide, which effectively fled the country after the disaster, for $470 million, down from their $3.3 billion request. And this amounted to about $500 per survivor when it was finally distributed in the early 90s. And this is money that really didn't go very far after these people, who many could not read or write, had to prove that they lived on the site 5 years earlier, that they were actually physically sick, had to get doctor's proof that they were ill, and that they had land title when many people didn't. As I mentioned, Union Carbide fled the factory site. They left it in horrible condition, and the waste disposal practices at the plant, this is not in Bhopal, this is in Utah, but this is a solar evaporation pond, and this was the method used to dispose of waste in Bhopal. And the groundwater in Bhopal was in fact contaminated before 1984, and because Union Carbide fled the scene, that groundwater is now being drunk by about 25,000 people every day in Bhopal, and it continues to spread in the aquifer. So Bhopal is not a historical date in time, a horrible thing that happened that we can never let happen again. It's that, but it's also being lived by the second generation of Bhopal survivors, the children of Bhopal, both of gas survivors and also of water contamination survivors. And these are just the most visible, horrifying effects, but there's a lot of growth retardation, mental, slow learning abilities to speak, to walk, delayed in a lot of these children. And so this disaster continues unabated because Dow Chemical, the owner of Union Carbide, refuses to take responsibility. Dow Chemical bought Union Carbide in 2001. They have a wonderful history of avoiding liability and responsibility for other toxic disasters, and so they felt that they could hedge their bets pretty well by putting $2.2 billion aside to cover about 500 people who were damaged or killed by Union Carbide's asbestos liabilities, but they decided that international law was weak enough that they'd be able to weasel out of Bhopal, and they said they had no responsibility and denied the existence of legal cases, including a criminal case charging Union Carbide and its former CEO with manslaughter to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So what are we asking for? The Campaign for Justice in Bhopal is made up of advocates in about 30 cities in the United States, including Amnesty International chapters, Association for India's Development, groups in the UK, groups around India. We are guided entirely by consensus-based decision-making in Bhopal. There's about 500,000 people who are affected. Of those, 23,000 have died. And the reason that I tell people why I got into this work is, how can 23,000 people have been poisoned to death and yet nobody is legally liable to this day? And how can we expect them to not put poison in our shampoos and our children's toys when they can get away with murdering 23,000 people? So we want clean water, we want justice, we want health care, and of course we want green jobs for the people who can no longer do the manual labor that sustained them before. And you saw the slums that were immediately next to the plant. They were the hardest hit, of course, and that's part of why this remains an environmental justice issue, is that the people who are middle class, who are also affected by the gas, sometimes lost their breadwinner or half their family, moved into unsettled areas near the plant, only to find a few years later that their water was contaminated, that they'd made this investment, and impoverished due to sickness, were not able to move. So the cycle of poverty and illness and chicken or egg question is large here as well. Does anyone recognize this ad? Either of these ads? So this is Dow's Forget About Bhopal campaign, otherwise known as the Human Element. And I think these particular ads are really interesting because of who is chosen to represent a DAO. These look like Indian children to me. I don't really know where they're from. But DAO has taken on this issue of clean water for all, and I've talked to DAO's CEO about this campaign while they're allowing these people to be poisoned in Bhopal every day. DAO has good reasons for not wanting to clean up Bhopal. They have horrible legacy issues in many other parts of the world. Their headquarters in Michigan is now the biggest dioxin site cleanup in the country. They've poisoned 22 miles plus of one river all the way out into Lake Huron. They, of course, have a number of toxic pesticides, products. Bisphenol A is in the news a lot lately. That's a DAO product as well. In my work on this environmental justice issue, I try to build connections in every chapter in the U.S. with what is the local environmental justice issue around you. I work with a lot of elite Indians who come to the United States for work here. They have an incredible amount of economic and political power in India, which we use to the Bhopalis' benefit. But I also ask them to start getting in touch with what is the environmental issue in Mission, Texas, if you're in Austin or Houston. What is the environmental issue in Baton Rouge? Come see what's going on in your community and not just let this be a nationalistic, distant thing, which it becomes for some Indians when they come here. But also, what is the bigger picture? What is DAO engaged in, and what is going on in our own bodies? If you don't care about people in India, you don't care about people in Baton Rouge or in New Orleans, what are these epidemics of environmental health, chronic illnesses? I think these are absolutely terrifying US and UK statistics, that my future baby boy has a 1 in 250 chance of not having the urethra of his penis come out the end and needing corrective surgery because of possibly because of reproductive effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so building into this very visual, very obvious crime, an understanding of the bigger picture that we're all carrying DAO chemicals, pesticides, and other chemicals in our bodies, and these may have effects on us as well. For example, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, did a study, I think it was in early 2001 or 2000, and they found 92% of Americans had Duraspan in their bodies at some level, or metabolites. And that's a neurotoxin. It's been banned for home use in the United States for killing and maiming a number of families and their children. And now Dow is marketing that pesticide for home use heavily around the world, and including in India. We're also really benefiting strongly as an environmental justice movement with international scope and using human rights framing. And Amnesty International has been a wonderful partner for us since 2004. And just bringing this message that is a huge trespass of our basic rights to have mother's milk be too toxic to meet food standards. And this is a book on Dow Chemical. It's about 400 pages, 20 of which are about Union Carbide and Bhopal. And the rest lies in Cancer Alley and in the Houston, south of Houston area, in Michigan. Around the world, Dow Chemical continues to work and wreak havoc. So back to Bhopal, we've had a number of fantastic victories, and the campaign is stronger than it has ever been because of really solid organizing from the grassroots of Bhopal around India and around the U.S. So we've gotten some water provision, and you see in these basic issues, like, wow, in the United States, it's expected that you get water, some kind of piped-in water in every home. And here we're talking about the government has a Supreme Court order for 4 years and full funding to provide clean water to these communities. And all that's being asked is a pipeline to bring the same water that goes to wealthy parts of Bhopal to the slums. And this is so preposterous that people who are poor should deserve clean water regardless of what the reason is. Finally, this pipeline is being built. It's being funded by the IMF, and a stipulation of the Monetary Fund grant, which we fought for this entire time, is that we must pay for the water when it finally arrives. And this is part of the global system of privilege and assumption and not taking into account the community needs that are evidenced here. We won't pay for this water, and that will have to be another fight down the line. The government was trying to clean up the surface site of Bhopal because it looks really awful and it's rather embarrassing by incinerating the waste. So the Bhopal survivors went to the neighborhoods where this was to be incinerated in a different state and informed them of what this community might be facing. They found this incinerator with no scrubber technology and in a community that was already heavily burdened with chemical factories. And we got the state of Gujarat, which housed the incinerator, to say we don't want the waste. So this turned into a legal battle, and a couple weeks ago, the picture on my left is what happened to that incinerator, simply because they were storing the waste in open warehouses with just a roof over them, and it combusted spontaneously and blew up. And this is sort of an I told you so moment, but also we've gotten an admission from the federal government that this waste will not be disposed of inappropriately, and it will have to be disposed of by Dow to OECD standards. There's also been a lot of grassroots work against Dow Chemical coming into India and building new plants until they can deal with the Bhopal issue. 500 women, for example, outside of Bombay decided when they heard that a Dow plant was coming into their area that they dug up the road on January 19th, and they parked their cows and their men and their carts and everything they could, and they camped out there, and they've been camping out there since then. They're still there now, and we hadn't heard about them before, but we absolutely supported them and got them out of jail with thousands of letters and hundreds of calls. And it's really interesting to me that just this incredible global movement and the power that a few actions can take. This is one volunteer in Dallas who decided to wear a Dow Grim Reaper outfit and hand out information about Bhopal in his city. And he took a picture of it, we sent it to India, it ended up being shared with this community, and that became the banner for this entire community, putting everything on the line to stop this Dow facility from going in. MIT times 7 is the Indian Institute of Technology. Very prestigious group of institutions have rejected Dow outright until it deals with Bhopal. They will not take any Dow money, will not take blood money, as many alumni have said. And again, this is something that IIT alumni in the United States started. They started petitions that they sent home and said, I'm really enraged about Bhopal. I don't think that Dow Chemical should be able to buy favor in the government and our institutions by investing and recruiting at the IITs. And so the result is this. So as we speak, there is a contingent of Bhopal survivors sleeping on the pavement in New Delhi. They've walked 500 miles from Bhopal to ask for the government to create a body that's funded for 30 years to do what the government has been unable to do till date, which is provide clean water, provide income generation projects, things that it's promised to do and wasted millions of dollars doing and not done. And so this is the final way that we can be sure that the government is accountable to these people by making sure that they're part of the solution. And we're making progress on this. The bill is being written effectively to create this commission. And also, we're asking for justice, of course, that Union Carbide be extradited. So I'm close to wrapping up here, but I just wanted to say a few more things that link into what folks were talking about earlier. Dow is one of these powerful companies. It can use the Indian government and the U.S. government effectively to combat a grassroots movement, a people's movement. People are shocked that the Indian government doesn't care about their citizens, or the elites who make the decisions about what's going to happen in Bhopal have a lot more to gain from Dow's investment than the people in Bhopal, certainly. And so that's why that differential continues. The other thing that has been really interesting in Bhopal is, the lack of academic support and technical support has made it very difficult, as in many of these EJ situations, environmental justice situations, to prove that there is harm, particularly with the water pollution. And so this clinic, the Sambhavna Clinic and Trust, which is free healthcare for water-poisoned people and gas-affected people in Bhopal, has done its own research in the absence of any help or expertise from the government, or outright poorly designed, intentionally poorly designed studies to show no effect by government or corporate forces. But there are so many ways that the kind of technologies that Dr. Cutter was talking about earlier can be incredibly helpful to these movements, and I really hope that there's some investigation or discussion that can come out of this conference about how networks of NGOs, like the Dow Accountability Network that I work with, can utilize these techniques in a broader way and have an intentional communication with NGO networks. For example, the Dow Accountability Network is mapping railroad routes for toxic of inhaled chemicals from the Gulf Coast all the way up to Michigan in order to inform communities that chlorine tanker cars that could gas their entire community to death, just like Bhopal, are coming through there. And if we had maps of what those communities consist of, who is most vulnerable, it would be incredibly helpful and an immobilizing tool. So things like that. There's a fence line work group of a group called Coming Clean that is a strategic body that discusses national chemical policy. And for those fence line groups to hear about these kinds of technologies on a regular basis would be incredibly helpful and immediately provide results. So the last thing I want to say is I'm here as a storyteller. There's an incredible storyteller who's just written a book called, his name is Indra Sinha, and his book is called Animals, People, and it's about modern-day Bhopal. It's fictional, but the characters really remind me of some people who are there now, and it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which is the highest award in fiction in the UK, as well as received a regional Commonwealth Prize, and it's for sale outside. If you want to know more about Bhopal or communicate with others about Bhopal, I really recommend the book. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is David Carruthers, who is teaches political science at San Diego State University and is the editor of Environmental Justice in Latin America. His talk is entitled Local Struggle, Global Justice, Environment and Equity on the U.S.-Mexico Border.
Assuming I can find it. I want to share some of the work that I've been doing on the U.S.-Mexico border that's trying to, in a sense, bring together these two very different literatures and research traditions. The environmental justice tradition, which we spent a lot of time on today, and also the Latin American social movement tradition. I'm a Latin Americanist. I've worked principally in Mexico and Chile. I study social movements. I also study environmental policy issues. I work on indigenous knowledge and resource management and forestry and agriculture. And across the years, in many different cases, I've been really struck by the ways Latin American activists and scholars weave these very conscious, compelling social justice narratives as they confront environmental challenges and environmental problems. So I've been trying to think about, as many people here today have, the ways in which the environmental justice discourse manifests in other parts of the world. How does this work? I want to spend very little time on conceptual material today because I think it's been covered so well, but I want to demonstrate my thinking and my research with emphasis on a couple of case studies that come from the border region. One of these, community dealing with industrial hazardous waste, and the second, the challenges and the injustices of the cross-border energy economy. And then I want to wrap up with a few lessons for environmental justice in Latin America more generally that we can derive from the border region. People have already done an excellent job covering all of this sort of conceptual material and giving you a sense about the U.S. environmental justice experience and some of the things that come from it. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of these. Obviously, distributional equity, a very fundamental principle that we've spent a lot of time on today, how environmental hazards are distributed throughout a society. Procedural equity, again, these questions about political participation, exclusion, recognition. Do people have a say in the political processes by which these decisions are made? And thirdly, this increasing thinking about environmental justice as a way to address kind of global questions, the big questions about justice north to south. Obviously, a huge part of that, the climate justice discourse that we've just spent time on, but also globalization and the global movement of capital and goods and trade and commodity chains. The environmental justice approach really focuses our vision on these normative questions and these very similar kinds of who's paying the costs, who enjoys the benefits, who makes the decisions, where does the power rest in the global economy. The lens that I want to use for this exploration is the US-Mexico border, which is a place that I find really quite fascinating and paradoxical. The direct collision between the wealth and power of the United States and the First World bumping up against the sort of developing world with such intensity. And it seems to provide to me a kind of window on a window for thinking about these big questions about globalization and the environment and about global justice, the tensions between rich and poor. Cities like Tijuana are the industrial boom towns of the era in which we live. The television sets, the laptop computers, the cellular phones, the luggage, the shoes, the things that we use every day are built or assembled in export processing zones in places like northern Mexico, China, Vietnam, India. Tijuana is this amazing paradox that is simultaneously rich and poor, simultaneously first world and developing world. By the aggregate indicators, it's one of the wealthier cities in Mexico. Mexico itself is a pretty substantially industrialized country. It's the 14th largest economy in the world. It's a city that has its fair share of billionaires with their mountaintop fortresses and their private fleets of limousines and their weekend vacation homes in Orange County. It's got its little first world pockets. If it weren't for the Spanish language in the corner, you wouldn't know that Carl's Jr. isn't in San Diego. It's condo developments, it's strip malls. But it's also, I think, a very graphic testament to the failures of development, a magnet for people who have been dispossessed or dislocated from every corner of Mexico. So roughly half the population works in the informal economy, live predominantly in squatter settlements that climb up the walls of the canyons and sprawl across the floodplains. 67% of the homes in Tijuana have dirt floors. 66% have no access to piped water. Thousands of families build their households out of pallets or what other materials they can get their hands on. They store household water supplies in chemical barrels that are discarded from the factories. The kids play in dirt and in soil that's saturated with chromium and xylene and lead from the factories. The observation I'm making is one that's, I think, become very present in the conversation today, that there's a price to pay for production. And in today's global economy, the people who enjoy this cascade of consumer goodies that we characterize as the miracles of globalization are spatially disconnected from and socially disconnected from the people who bear the costs. One of the women I interviewed said it, I think, very succinctly, that if we think of the world as neighborhoods, then obviously this is one of the poor neighborhoods. Here's where we pay the costs. To illustrate these ideas, let's go ahead and jump into these case studies. For many decades, Mexico's industrial development strategy has really centered on encouraging international companies to locate in the border industrial region to take advantage of relatively lax or limited environmental regulations, low tax structures, generous subsidies, and above all, a low-wage, non-unionized workforce, fraction of the wages that you would see in the United States or Canada. Right now, the prevailing wage is about $50 for a 48-hour work week, so just a bit over $1 an hour. Business leaders, government leaders, of course, hail the maquiladora sector and the export processing economy as a real model of Mexico's future. It brings jobs, it brings economic opportunities, it boosts the gross national product. There have been many critics raising questions about the limitations of the sweatshop economy. There's a lot of research on workplace health and safety and labor abuses and those kinds of issues. I've been working mostly on industrial hazardous waste. Many of the industries that have located in the border region of northern Mexico, from Baja all the way to Matamoros at the other end, produce high levels of hazardous waste. There's a lot of electronics assembly, a lot of production of chemicals, paints, solvents, auto parts. So here's my little homemade slide. By the laws that establish the export processing sector in Mexico, because all of the components are being delivered to the maquiladoras for assembly, and the goods are being returned to the United States for export, the only thing that's supposed to take place on the Mexican side is the assembly of the products. In theory, according to the customs codes and the legislation that establishes this sector, any of the industrial hazards or byproducts of that production must also be returned to the United States and be properly disposed of in EPA-authorized sites. Across the 1980s and 1990s, during the big boom years for the maquiladora sector, the compliance was extremely low, usually about 1 to 3% by most estimates. We had a decent tracking system, the HazTrax data set, which ended in 2003. By 2003, we had much better compliance. We're up to about 25%. But that still means that 75% of the industrial hazardous waste produced in these factories is being dumped into the mesas and the canyons and the hills of Tijuana. And this is manifest measurably in accumulations of chemicals and heavy metals in soils, in waters, in clusters of anencephalic birth defects, in cancers, in respiratory problems, skin diseases. One example, car battery recycling plants. Most of us don't think about where our car batteries go when we're done with them. We buy a new one. If you live in Colonia Chilpancingo, you certainly think about where the car batteries end up. This is a Tijuana neighborhood of about 10,000 people. It's right at the foot of a major industrial park, at the edge of which sat this facility here, Metales y Derivados. It's an abandoned battery smelter. It started operating in 1972. It operated for 22 years to extract lead and other metals from U.S. car batteries. This entire time, there's a very acute sense in the community that things are wrong. The fish die off. The river becomes foul. The kids start getting sick. They complain to the press. They complain to the government. There are studies done that vindicate their concerns, but nothing changes. Until the early 1990s, as the NAFTA debate starts heating up in the U.S. Congress, and you have U.S. congressional representatives wandering around the neighborhood, and there's this concern about the environmental contamination across the border as a representative of what NAFTA could portend. Under that pressure, Mexico's environmental ministry finally shuttered the plant in 1994. But the owner fled across the border and left behind 24,000 tons of hazardous waste and some tarps and some drums to contain it. In the 1990s, a citizens group called the Chilpancingo Pro-Environmental Justice Collective formed to start lobbying for a cleanup. I won't take the time to tell you this story, but it's about a 12-year-long saga of the kinds of strategies that you've heard reference to: protests and marches, sit-ins, letter writing campaigns. Also, a pretty sophisticated legal strategy. They formed a coalition with a San Diego-based environmental justice group. In 1998, they brought this to the NAFTA Environmental Commission in Montreal. In February 2002, this little community group of powerless, penniless, working-class moms really worried about the health of their kids actually won this case at the CEC board in Montreal, which vindicated their claims, but it, of course, came with no money for cleanup or enforcement. The community kept their campaign up for another couple of years. Finally, in 2004, the U.S. government and the Mexican government came up with some money to begin a cleanup campaign. It really wasn't until last year that we started seeing significant progress on the cleanup. by now, this month, more or less, the remediation is pretty well done. All of the toxic have been hauled off. The site is finally in remediation after 25 some years. So that's one small success story for a local environmental justice organization. It means a lot to the people in Chilpancingo, but of course there are hundreds of these sites, thousands of these sites in the factory zones all over the developing world. These are the hidden prices of our global economy. The second case is a story of cross-border environmental injustice that I find both fascinating and aggravating. It's one that's gotten very little attention. You might remember California's disastrously unsuccessful deregulation experiment in the energy sector in 2000 and 2001 when our friends at Enron and others moved in and gamed the system very effectively. We had a series of rolling blackouts. In the wake of that disaster, the energy companies looked very explicitly at northern Baja California as an opportunity to locate power, thermoelectric plants, power lines, liquefied natural gas terminals, pipelines. The energy sector sees enormous demand in the western United States, but they also know that it's always very difficult to site these kinds of facilities in California or in Oregon or in Arizona. So the assumption is we can build these facilities in Mexico, we're going to meet less resistance, it's going to be cheaper, the permitting will be more quick, and we'll be able to move that energy across the border. In the first year, the companies proposed about 20 different thermoelectric power plants for the northern tier of Mexico. I'm going to focus my attention just on a couple of these that went into the border city of Mexicali. These are very powerful companies. They have a lot of political clout in Mexico. The governments are fairly weak there. These plants were up and running by 2003, really before the communities had any sense what was happening. At that point, the only thing that community activists could do was really challenge the infrastructure by which the electricity from the plants was being brought into the United States. So a cross-border coalition of environmental justice groups from the U.S. and the Mexican side won a string of court cases in the United States. Essentially, a number of judges at pivotal points agreed that Entergen and Sempra, the two companies responsible for these plants, had conspired to export electricity to California by placing plants in Mexico that were not built to meet U.S. EPA or California emissions standards. They literally placed dirtier, more polluting plants in Mexicali, a city that has very serious air pollution problems, than they could legally place inside the United States. So again, from the environmental justice standpoint, if we think of this region as neighborhoods, we have a distributive injustice because we've put these polluting facilities in the brown, poor neighborhood. We have a procedural injustice, a lack of recognition. The locals got very little say in the matter. I think most glaringly, 100% of the Sempra plant and 60% of the Entergen plant capacity are not even hooked up to the Baja grid. They export power to the United States, pure and simple. They carry the electricity on these big lines up to the Imperial Valley substation and ship it north. So the Mexicans bear the pollution while Californians enjoy an electricity supply that we didn't have 8 years before. The last case that I want to touch on is the case of liquefied natural gas. This is a very hot topic now in global energy. This is a preferred fuel for power plants. It's much cheaper than oil. It has a much lower carbon footprint. We have abundant gas supplies, but unfortunately natural gas is located in very distant places like Yemen or Indonesia or Bolivia or Russia. It's also volatile and dangerous and much harder to handle. So the scientific solution for this is liquefaction. If you take natural gas down to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, its volume collapses by 600 times. and you can put liquefied natural gas in a special freezer tanker, pull it across the ocean, dock up, unload it, warm it up to room temperature, it expands back at 600 volume, you throw it into the pipeline system. So there is a global race to bring liquefied natural gas to market. All of the big energy companies are in this. There is no liquefied natural gas facility on the West Coast. There are many planned, but there is certainty that they will be meeting a lot of resistance in places like California and Oregon and British Columbia. The companies, again, looked to Mexico. Very quickly, 6 proposals out by 2002. Of the 6 proposed for northern Baja, only 1 got built so far. I'm going to start with a couple of stories that tell of community successes. The first 2 facilities were proposed in 2002. One of them by a Houston company called Marathon Oil for a community called Playas de Tijuana, about 5 miles from the border. The second, ConocoPhillips and El Paso Petroleum Project for the community of Rosarito Beach, about 20 miles further down. Mexican government very quickly came up with the permits for these facilities. But as has been common with cases of environmental justice, again, a reference to something that we saw last night with Dr. Taylor's talk, people rally around threats to the places that they live and work and play. There was enormous mobilization on the streets, housewives, neighborhood associations, student groups, and they stopped these projects with the same kinds of strategies that we've been talking about. This got very little attention, virtually no attention in the United States, but it was a big deal in the Mexican media and eventually became a national issue in Mexican politics. It became contested enough that political officials did not want to be associated with the projects, eventually withdrew their support, stopped authorizing the local permits. The companies gave up and withdrew. From those community successes, however, the companies learned, and in particular Sempra Energy, which realized that the problem is locating dangerous, unsightly industrial facilities in densely populated residential neighborhoods. So let's move it out to 400 acres of spectacular undeveloped coastal land about 15 miles out of Ensenada, where they put in the Costa Azul facility. This is a massive facility, 2 200-foot insulated towers, a jetty, a pier. This comes online, in fact, this month, April 2008. So this is pretty much done. There are a number of liquefied natural gas facilities proposed, some dead, some dormant. But the main observation I'm making here, similar to the power plant observation, you put the dangerous facility in the Mexican side, the gas that it produces mainly goes up to the north. So I'll move to conclusion by making the observation that these cases have really energized communities on both sides of the border. We have 35 community organizations in northern Baja working just on liquefied natural gas. This message of injustice is one that I think really resonates all over Mexico. This is a senator during one of the hearings in Mexico City who actually says to approve these gas plants would consist of treason to the country. So it's a sort of a real sense of violation. I always have loved this image from one of the rallies in Ensenada, and I think this speaks directly to David Schlossberg's observation about disrespect. For those of you who don't read Spanish, this says, Mexico, there are those who love you and those who use you. And in Spanish, use spells out the acronym USA. So that's what I find so fascinating about environmental justice. It's a movement that connects with people. I believe it's having an empowering and a transformative legacy in Latin America. As Kimberly suggested, I recently worked with a bunch of really talented and interesting people on a collaborative project looking at cases from all over Latin America, community resistance to water and gas privatization in Bolivia, U.S. Navy bombing range in Puerto Rico, ethanol projects in Brazil. And what we essentially find, and what I argue in the book, is that environmental justice is something that exists in Latin America. It doesn't use the language we use. They don't have access to the wonderful data sets that Dr. Cutter has presented. And it doesn't take shape in the ways that we would all recognize. But as Joan Martinez-Alier has referred to the environmentalism of the poor, it's a kind of environmental consciousness that resonates locally, that takes on kind of diverse and diffuse localized meanings that adhere where people feel threatened, where they see these challenges. And I think what's most important in the Latin American case is that this is a region that has a very strong tradition of social justice organizing. They've lived through many years of dictatorships and Cold War repression. In recent years, they've really struggled to organize against the kind of radical market fundamentalist experiments that governments have put in place. That gives them a lot of social movement experience. It gives them an organizational infrastructure. So as environmental issues appear, they just kind of weave into that experience and become part of that, that social justice consciousness. It's not a uniformly positive story. I could just as easily have chosen 3 stories of heartbreaking setbacks, but it is one that I think demonstrates, I do think that the environmental justice story for Latin America is one that demonstrates a lot of possibility, both as a banner of community resistance and also as a way that scholars and policy analysts can think about constructing a more just future for Latin America.
Thank you, and we have time for questions.
Question for David. How do you pronounce it last? Carruthers? Carruthers. I'm Dominican American. I was born here. My parents were born in the Dominican Republic. I spent 5 months in the Dominican Republic in 2006. And I got there in May 2006. And when I got there, the country was in the midst of a congressional election. And what I found that was really, really interesting was that everyone who's Dominican is political. I mean, even the 5-year-olds would give you a political position on who they thought should win for their own reasons. Came back over to the United States, and I don't come from the world of academia. I didn't graduate from college. I always worked in pretty much business and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I always did my own activism. Then I got hired by a nonprofit organization, the New Jersey Work Environment Council. And one of the things that I don't see happening is that I don't see this in a real political context. And like you said, in Latin America, we don't use the term environmental justice. To us, it's all about social justice and political self-determination. I just ran for school board and lost in the city of Perth Amboy, where I was born and raised. And I had a $2,500 budget. The local political machine had $30,000. Got about 1,000 votes. They got about 1,400 votes. Now, if I would have had $30,000, I'm beating that political machine, and I would have been able to bring an environmental justice agenda to the board. Or if I run for a city council or mayor or whatever. In other words, here in America, how do we get to the point of where we really start talking about political self-determination and funding, not just academic research, which is cool, or little campaign issues, which is cool, or just talking about agitating and what was one of the panels, agitating, litigating, and legislating, but actually really talking about funding real political work that will get to the core of I think all of these issues, which is, again, we don't have real progressive people in power. In Latin America, we don't think about these things in terms of environmental justice. We talk about, again, political self-determination and social justice. So that's kind of my question.
Well, that sounds more like a comment than a question. Is this working? I don't think I have a satisfying answer. I think that the people who address the questions that you're raising about raising a sense of political consciousness and salience are the people that were speaking earlier in the day. And one of the things that I think is interesting in the border region is the way in which the two very different worlds, two different traditions of organizing politically, two different ways of thinking about what environmental issues are and social justice are, have met and managed to kind of find common ground. So I think the border is interesting just because you have people who come from a Mexican political tradition, which is where I've done a lot of work. And as you say, there's just this really intrinsic sense of political agitation and spirit. But there's also a sense of hopelessness because the state is weak, the institutions are corrupt, the sense that they can actually make a difference is low. And in some respects, the U.S. experience is sort of the reverse. So as they sit down and strategize and come up with ways, they kind of try to build on the strengths of both traditions. But, you know, part of the problem with being up here as a representative of this book is that all of these cases are so incredibly different, and the experience is so different from country to country that it's very difficult for me to speak sort of uniformly about a Latin American environmental justice tradition.
Your question just brought up something for me that I've really noticed working on the Bhopal issue for a couple years, which is the difference in Indian democracy and how it works. And while India is incredibly socially stratified, and the things that people will say about Muslims and poor people in the public sphere without any sort of shame would cause them to be immediately removed from office in the United States. But at the same time, their media is incredibly diverse because of different language needs, and protest gets covered in India in a way that protest is absolutely not covered. The real issues are in the papers on a regular basis, really discussing the content rather than few-line coverage of protests of hundreds of thousands of people. And there's also this feeling of a potential overthrow and riot when you get these huge numbers of people on the streets. In Bhopal, you can get 300 women within a few hours. If there's something going on at a particular official's house and we feel that this official is doing something really awful to the community, for example, allowing pesticide dust to go into sickened communities, you'll have 300 women come out of the community immediately, and there's a real sense of physical fear on the part of the government in this country where a lot of Americans feel, oh, it's, you know, country of Gandhi, peaceful. The protests have that energy that is not here in the United States, and I'm not necessarily advocating that it should have any import of violence, but that's something that's really noticeable, and a difference about how democracy works. Something to consider. But certainly the media aspect is just crippling in the United States, I feel.
I think industry has learned to anticipate and try to get ahead of the potential agenda and frame it in ways and sort of derail it as much as they possibly can and anticipate where they think the problems will be. So I think industry learns very quickly. That's what I thought. That's what I sort of took from this liquefied natural gas story, that industry very quickly said, okay, well, if we put them in neighborhoods, we run into trouble. Let's buy up this huge piece of property. That'll just displace a few poor fishermen and a handful of farmers and maybe a couple of California surfers. And they're not going to be able to organize, and they won't be able to stop us. But then the other thing that they do is very clearly tie it to a discourse of energy security and America's energy needs and a cooperative relationship across the border so that we can help create a prosperous border region and sort of frame. They struggled mightily to frame things in very positive terms. One of these was one of the ones that eventually withdrew was actually an offshore facility in the middle of a national marine protected area off the coast. And they tried to frame this in a language of, we're going to protect the habitat of the endangered Xantu murrelet by building a 1,000-foot concrete breaker in the middle of these islands. And it was just bizarre to watch Chevron trying to present themselves as environmental stewards while coming forward with a project so ill-conceived.
That's absolutely the case, and I think one thing that I just learned about the chemical industry this year is that they're trying to jump onto this green bandwagon by having the very best facilities built that are very energy efficient and not discharge into the water in the U.S. facilities to help ignore the fact that their exact product is causing cancer. And you can have an incredibly perfect clean facility turning out poison, and have people who have really good intentions cutting their energy emissions down to nearly nothing relative to what they were 5 years ago. And that seems to be something that Dow in particular is doing very well.
Microphone. I think Wilma has some. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
The greenhouse gas mitigation efforts were, for a very long time, critical of industry as a whole, of greenhouse gas consuming industries in general, or emitting industries in general, and fossil fuel industries in particular. And the momentum turned around when, instead of saying what we didn't want them to do, we started saying what we did want them to do, and started pointing to examples in which multinational corporations started to behave responsibly. And given, for instance, that it's inevitable that even if you were utterly unbiased and threw darts at a map to locate facilities that, after all, inconvenience the people and endanger the people around them, inevitably, we all want things that these corporations produce. And that inevitably, even if you do it completely randomly, the groups that are least able to fight wrong are the ones, are the places where these facilities are going to exist. How do you know, first of all, what do you want them to do? And how do you know when they've succeeded? I know it's obvious that what Dow did in Bhopal is forbidden, right? We need to be held accountable. But is there another, can you sort of sketch out and enrich for us the other side?
I think that there's a lot of ideas of what we want them to do. We'd like to see green chemistry. We'd like to see precautionary thinking. If we're going to develop this product, what are the toxic inputs? What are the toxic outputs? What's the health effect of this product on both the people who buy it and the workers who are making it before it comes to market? And the question of whether a multinational corporation is going to be accountable, I think, is an open one. It's very difficult for anyone to be accountable to any given community if they can get up and leave the next day and have very little financial consequence for that. I do think that local or at least national industries can be slightly more accountable to the people who are affected by their products and their operations. But in Bhopal, for example, we have a list of probably 50 different local industries like soap making, solar lantern renting, organic gardening of herbs that are used to treat disorders that are found in poisoned people that we want to scale up, and we've actually tried on the ground already to create a healing set of industries in this incredible industrial wounding. But where's the funding to make that happen, and where's the expertise to make it happen? Particularly the expertise is still being developed in income generation for green jobs, and also just green chemistry broadly throughout the United States. There's not enough of that, and so that's just something that's being invested in now, I think, in the United States. But you can't have a toxic product manufactured in some other country and shipped over to the U.S. and expect there to be a good solution for that. You can't have toxic products. We can't allow that to continue. We have to look at the entire cycle and fix the whole rather than hoping to find just another cheap place that's farther away from people to make toxic products.
But if I can push back just a little bit on that, the fact is that we don't know how to test people to find out the interactive effects of chemicals on their understand is village. And so the question is, what do you want these companies to do? To test to find out whether or not their chemicals are dangerous. I don't think we want the chemical industry of the world to just be eliminated. Right? So the question is, what exactly?
I think that there is a lot that we know from animal studies, and what industry will tell you over and over again is that animal studies and human studies don't match. But we test drugs on animals and find what's safe to give to people as drugs. I don't see why the chemical industry can't do the same thing with chemicals.
Well, that's a very positive thing to do, but of course, the problem with drug studies is that the interactive effects we still don't understand. That's what happens. They test a drug at a time, but the interactions of the drugs aren't tested.
I think we have time for one more question, and I would love to hear from Wilma Suber, who actually is, in fact, an environmental chemist.
We in Louisiana have 2 LNG facilities, one taken out of mothballs, the second one went online last week. I have a question for David. I served on the National Advisory Commission to the U.S. Commissioner of the CEC, and we worked a lot on the procedures and making it more transparent when you did a citizen's petition. And, of course, the citizens will never see or never understand the results of that effort. But do you find that that is a mechanism that works, particularly in Mexico?
Well, I think in part that I'm glad you raised that question, because it's also part of what my response to the previous question would be, is that one of the things that people in this area are looking for is ways of encouraging more responsible corporate behavior and better corporate citizenship. And for example, in the maquiladora sector, there's enormous diversity in the level of corporate citizenship or lack thereof. There are some companies that actually say, we're just uniformly going to impose the same standards we would impose if we were in Europe or North America or in Central America or in Asia. There are other companies who say explicitly, the laws are too tough in the United States, we're moving to Mexico hoping that we can duck them. So one of the things that groups like the Anti-Sweatshop Campaign and other kind of globalization activists have done is try to put pressure on companies to think about their image, as well as on governments to be more effective. And then at the third level is there's this whole question about, can we move in the direction of global corporate codes of conduct and international mechanisms of corporate accountability and more democratic, more participatory international mechanisms. The NAFTA institutions were very modest in their aims, I think, and people were extremely cynical about their capacity initially. My answer to your question is that I no longer just dismiss them as empty window dressing, because I do think that they create a space that didn't used to exist where grievances can gain visibility and legitimacy. And it's a very soft kind of power, but it is a kind of power that didn't exist before. It's not enforcement, it's not effective, it's not funded. They can't make a weak state or a state that lacks capacity into a stronger or more effective state, but they can create pressures and bring visibility to issues. So I think in general, I'm probably after, how many years is it now? 14 years since NAFTA, I've become more open to the possibility that the CEC actually has more capacity or more potential than I would have originally guessed. So I think yes is the answer.
So our final panel, we actually heard a lot of references in this conversation and earlier in the day to the very rather complicated relationship that the environmental justice movement has with the scientific community. And fortunately, we will get to address that in some depth in the next panel, which will start at 3:15. But I would like to thank our panelists today for very informative, enlightening